Good afternoon. My name is Heath Rowe, and I'm a research operations manager on the Insights Lab, part of Brand Studio. And we're here today for a talk by Gloria Mark. Gloria Mark is a professor in the Department of Informatics at the University of California in Irvine. And her research focuses on how the use of technology affects our lives in real-world contexts. She received her PhD in psychology from Columbia University. And before working at UCI, she worked at the German National Research Center for Information Technology and has served as a visiting researcher at Microsoft Research since 2012, as well as IBM and the MIT Media Lab. Today, she's going to talk about her work using sensors, experience sampling, computer logging, and repeated surveys to study the workplace experience, specifically how attention focus, stress, and affect are impacted by digital media use, as well as how our attention focus varies over the workday. Ladies and gentlemen, Gloria Mark.
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here, not so far away from Irvine. So I am really interested in understanding how digital media affects our lives. And how does this clicker, oops. Okay, so my starting point is that most people are by nature monochronic. And what that means is most people, like myself, prefer to start on a task and finish it through to completion before switching to something else. But we live in a digital age and we are required to work in a polychronic way. So most people have multiple devices, you work on multiple applications, you have multiple apps open on your laptop, desktop. Some people have iPads, and we're always switching our attention between devices and applications. And it forces us to work in a polychronic way, and that's against what our nature is. So in particular, I'm very interested in the idea of multitasking. And people sometimes think of multitasking as working on two things at the same time. And that's impossible for human beings to literally work on two things at the same time. You can walk and chew gum, but this is an unconscious kind of process. But what it really refers to is switching very rapidly between different tasks, between different contexts. You can think of it like time sharing among computers. Right? So when we talk about multitasking, that's really what we're referring to, this rapid context shifting back and forth. Now, a lot of people have tried to measure multitasking. And the most typical way that is measured is you ask people, how much do you multitask? Well, this is not very fruitful because research has shown that people can be off by about 30% in their estimates of how much time they spend on computing or just estimating time in general. People are notoriously bad at estimating time. You could bring people in a laboratory and you can give them some kind of artificial task and watch how fast or how well they switch. But that's artificial and it doesn't begin to model all the kinds of things we experience in real world work, like career trajectories and conflicts and social pressures and deadlines and how tired we feel and so on. So my perspective is that if we really want to study people and understand them, we have to go where people are. So we have to create living laboratories, and that's what I do. And if you do this kind of approach, we can ask questions like, how fragmented is our attention with digital media? How can we explain distraction with digital media? How does digital media use affect mood? Because it does. So let me start off by talking about the introduction of digital media in the workplace. So I'm very often asked, well, gee, didn't people always multitask? You know, what is new about this? So let's take a look. So unfortunately, nobody has done any study at the level of detail that we have, where we use sensors and track behavior to the second, which I'll talk about shortly. But what people have done is historically they followed people around in the workplace and they've timed them to see what their distribution of time is with different activities. And if you look here at these, the studies that are represented in the two right columns represent studies that were done when personal computing and email became widespread in use in the workplace. And the studies to the left, they were not really in widespread use. The study, Stevens et al., 1992, was sort of mixed. And I want you to look in particular at how desk work has changed and how scheduled meetings. Scheduled meetings refers to formally scheduled face-to-face meetings. And I want you to look at these two columns on the right and contrast that with the work done by the other studies. And the Horn and Lupton study in 1965 with scheduled meetings is a bit of an anomaly. And tell me if you notice any trends here. You notice anything? What do you notice? What's changed? Huh? Okay, the amount of time spent at the desk is increasing, and what about, and meetings are decreasing. So if we put these two trends together, right, we see that proportion of time spent at desk work nearly doubled with the introduction of IT in the workplace, and people spend a less proportion of their time in scheduled face-to-face meetings. And this suggests that work that was formerly done in face-to-face meetings is now being done to a larger extent at the desktop, through email, through desktop conferencing, through other kinds of means. So I'm very fortunate to be interested in this topic at the cusp of a revolution in the development of sensor technology, wearable technologies, and other kinds of sensor technologies. And so, my students and I used to track people in the workplace. We used to shadow people, and we had these timers, and every time people would take a different action, like pick up the phone, we would do start time, they'd put the phone down, stop time, and recorded every single action that people did. And it was very, very labor intensive. But the advantage is that we could understand the context, right? So as a byproduct of measuring these activities, we got a sense of what people's work life was like. But when you use sensors, you miss that context, right? The sensors are just recording bits of information. And so the grand challenge, as I see it, is to what extent can we automatically capture behavior with sensors to gain the same level of insights, the same level of deep knowledge we can about human behavior that we could with human ethnographic observation. Ethnographic observation is when people actually follow people around and observe. And I have several projects that I've been working on. Today I will only talk about the Health Sense project, which is dealing with information workers. I have another large study, the Millennial Project, which tracked college students and their use of digital media. So let me go through the measures that I use, because this is going to help you understand the data. So we measure stress using heart rate monitors. We measure electrodermal activity using these devices that are called Affectiva Q sensors. Actually, these days, we're using other wearable devices. We measure people's mood and focus through something called experience sampling. These are probes that people get where they record their subjective opinion about something. And I'm going to talk about that later. That's in the upper right is an example of what a probe looks like. We measure face-to-face interaction with sense cams. That's this lower right picture. It's a small little camera, very lightweight, people wear. Takes continual photos about every 20, 30 seconds. And then we can apply face detection software to see if there's a face present or not in the image. And it's very accurate. We log people's computer and phone activity. We measure people's activity using actigraphs, which everyone knows Fitbit as a common actigraph. We measure sleep rhythms, and we give a whole lot of demographic and personality kinds of measures. So let me start by giving you an example of what your digital media use can reveal about you. Now, some people have done this kind of work where they mine the content. So they analyze the content. For example, in social media, they do sentiment analysis to see what kind of words people are using. But if we just look at temporal features, right, no content, but temporal features like the average amount of time you spend on digital media, the dispersion. Are you using it all at one time? Are you using it throughout the day? When is the device on and off? How much social media are you using? Again, not content. What's your rhythm of usage? Do you have a regular pattern or is it irregular? What time of day is it mostly used? And we find that we can predict personality. These are the big 5 personality traits, if you're familiar with them. This is a commonly used measure of personality. We can predict these traits from temporal features alone with fairly high accuracy. Okay. So let's start with a question very much related to multitasking, which is how fragmented are people's attention in the workplace? And by fragmented, how much do they actually switch contexts? Okay, so here is a measure from logging people's computer activity. This is the average duration of time that people spend on any computer screen before switching. And if you look at all computer usage, the median length of time is 40 seconds. That means that every 40 seconds, people are switching on average, right? Well, it's actually the median to another screen. That's a very short amount of time. And if we look at averages of how often people switch within apps, that means you open up Word and then you're opening up other documents within Word, or you're surfing the internet. People switch about 112 times a day. And switching between apps, which is even more of a context shift, going from the internet to a Word document to email, that's about 261 times a day. So, no, this, sorry, that is seconds, but the switches within apps and between apps actually refer to number of instances. Sorry about that. That's should be labeled differently. So people's workday typically is characterized by very short durations of attention on any computer screen and lots of switching. There is an assumption made that when a computer screen is in the forefront and active, we make an assumption that that's a proxy for attention. And it's not always the case. Now, we do have decision rules. So if a screen comes up really quick and then goes off, we make this assumption that people's attention, it's not long enough for people to really focus, right, to have any kind of meaningful focus. So we have decision rules where we filter out screens that are just up for very brief moments of time. So for example, sometimes people might click on a web page and then click immediately to something else, so we disregard that because we can't expect that people are actually going to focus and spend cognitive resources when that shift is so fast. The median focus duration on any computer screen we find is 40 seconds. Now, we wondered that maybe, not everybody is alike. Maybe there are individual differences that can explain focus duration. And so we hypothesized that the following things would be related to the amount of time that people would spend focused on any computer screen. Neuroticism is a personality trait. It's characterized by people who just can't suppress thoughts that come into your head. And people who are highly neurotic generally have short attention spans. We hypothesized that people who are impulsive would have a shorter attention span on the computer. There are two dimensions of impulsivity that we checked. One is a sense of urgency, right? You can't hold yourself back. You just have to act. Another dimension, lack of perseverance, right? That people just don't have what it takes to persevere on a task. People who are susceptible to stress, and we hypothesize that people who did not sleep, did not have long sleep durations the night before, would have shorter attention durations. And we also hypothesized that the longer the attention duration on any computer screen would be associated with a higher assessed productivity at the end of the day. And the neuroticism and impulsive urgency hypotheses were supported. There was strong trend for the sleep and stress hypotheses to be supported, and productivity, this hypothesis was supported. So we also did what's called a factor analysis, where we put all these variables into a program to see if there's a latent structure in the variables. And indeed, we found a latent variable that we label lack of control, which is comprised of people that are high in neuroticism, who are high in this impulsive urgency kind of variable, and people who are susceptible to stress. And this is predictive. The more lack of control people have, the shorter is their focus duration. And I'm going to come back to this idea of lack of control later on. Now, you might be asking, well, so what? So what if I switch from Excel to Word to email, but what if I'm working on the same project, right? Maybe it doesn't make a difference, right? Because right now I'm agnostic to task, and I'm just talking about these switches between computer screens. So let's go a little bit deeper, and let's look at the task level. This is work that was done by a former student of mine, Victor Gonzalez, with great effort, who categorized these smaller actions into, clustering them into different tasks. And it took him a great deal of time. And here's what he found. That first of all, people work in an average of about 12 different projects. We call these working spheres of work. And people spend about 10.5 minutes in any of these working spheres before switching to something else. So 10.5 minutes is not a really long period of time. And I know, I'm an academic and I write papers, and 10.5 minutes is not a very long time for me to get sufficiently deep into beginning a task, and then I'm switching. So let's look at rhythms of attention over the day. So I want to give you a little bit of psychology theory. So there's a number of researchers who've talked about this idea of attention focus, and it goes by different names. It goes by the term cognitive absorption. Others have called it cognitive engagement. How many of you have heard of mindfulness? Okay, you're living in LA, you know about mindfulness. How many of you have heard of flow? Okay, flow is the idea that you're so deeply immersed with your attention that you become completely unaware of the passage of time. So all of these ideas are related. And then in contrast, people speak about boredom. And the research shows that all of these different constructs related to attention are associated with positive affect. People are happy when they're deeply immersed and engaged. And when they're bored, generally people are not happy. And that's what the research studies show. So here's how you might conceptualize attention: being highly engaged or not engaged in some activity, right? That's a simple continuum. And so we thought about this and we hypothesized that there would be an orthogonal dimension that we call challenge. And we came up with this idea because the concept of flow involves challenge. When people are in a state of flow, right, they're also challenged to some degree. And so we came up with this conceptual framework, and we put labels on these. And let me explain them. So people who are highly engaged and highly challenged, we use a label of focus. This is when people are in a state of focus. And if people are really engaged in something, but they're not at all challenged, we call this rote, as in rote work. An example is playing solitaire, right? When people play solitaire, you're really engaged, but you're not challenged. And the other label, bored, is when you're not at all challenged and you're just not engaged. We label that bored. And the last one is being challenged in something, but you're not engaged. We call that frustrated. It's just a label. An example would be a software developer who has a bug. They're just really, really frustrated. They're challenged by it, and they just can't engage themselves into trying to work it out. I mentioned that this is the probe that we used. So we gave people these probes throughout the day, on the average about 18 times a day. People were asked, the top part is called Russell's Circumplex Model of Mood. It's a well-validated measure of mood, self-reported mood. And the bottom, we asked people, how engaged were you in the thing you were just doing, and how challenged were you in the thing you were just doing? People were trained in this, and they were able to answer these probes within a few seconds. These probes came about 18 times a day, and the irony is not lost on me that we're interrupting people 18 times a day. But we got really great data. And people submit this, we get a timestamp, and we can align the timestamp so we see what people's subjective moods and engagement and challenges in relation to the computer activities that they're doing. And we also look at stress, and we have other measures. So in contrast to what all this other research shows, that people are happiest when they're engaged, we actually find that the mean level of happiness is highest when people are doing rote work. So when people are doing this kind of mindless work, you're engaged, but you're just not using your mental resources, that's when people are the happiest. So if we slice up this idea of engagement and attention, and we slice it up in terms of being challenged and not challenged, we find there's a difference. People are least happiest when they're bored, and you're saying, why are there dotted lines with frustrated? That's because hardly anyone in our sample reported being frustrated, so we didn't have enough data to make any conclusions. This is what the average attention looks like over the course of the day. The black line is focused, and there's a couple of interesting things about this graph. So people are at their peak focus in the morning, about 11 a.m., so late morning, and also roughly about 3 p.m. And what's also interesting, at least for me, is that people don't come into the workplace ramped up and ready to go, but it takes them time to ease into a deeper attentional state. Let's talk about distractions. So first, one of an interesting idea about interruptions is we always think of interruptions in terms of external notification. right? You get an email notification or a social media notification, or a colleague comes into the office, or you get a phone ringing. But there's this other phenomenon we call internal interruptions or self-interruptions. The best way I can describe it is you're observing someone and they're typing on a Word doc, and for no apparent reason, they suddenly stop what they're doing and they turn and pick up the phone. Or they stop and they check email or social media. That's a self-interruption. I know I do it. Since I've been doing this research, I became much more aware of how much I do it. Now, we took the data and we divided it up into hourly segments. And we looked at the proportion of external and internal interruptions in each of those hourly segments throughout the day, over the course of days. And we found something really interesting, that when external interruptions waned, we saw that internal interruptions kicked in and started to become high. It's not that when external interruptions stopped that people suddenly had peace of mind and were able to work without interruptions. They began to interrupt themselves. That's what the data showed. And this suggests to me that people are conditioned to be interrupted, to work in very short attention spans. And if you're not being interrupted by external sources, then people will interrupt themselves. And that would be a sign of being conditioned. Okay, now, distractions. There's this, a lot of work has been done in interruptions, and people have assumed in this work that people are, really absorbed in their work, and then along comes a distraction, and all of a sudden people get bored, right? Along comes a social media distraction, and then it takes you away from this deep engagement. Well, what if it's the reverse? What if people are first in a state of boredom, and that makes them susceptible to a distraction? And so that's the question we asked. So first, let me tell you a little bit about types of interruptions. So workplace communications comprise 40% of interruptions. There's email. These are the top offenders. Email is primarily work-related, at least in the workplaces we studied, they were. Face-to-face can be either work-related or social. And Facebook, which was the main social media platform used in the particular company we studied, that's primarily social. And to give you an idea of the extent to how much, how often and how much people spend on these types of communications, we see people in our sample visited Facebook about 21 times a day, email checked about 74 times a day. The high person in our sample was about 465 times a day. But people spend relatively short durations of time. They check Facebook, but then spend about 18 seconds on it. And email, they check it often, but spend just about 32 seconds. So they don't, this is the typical profile of the information worker who we studied. And here's what we find when we looked at the data. We found, based on this experience sampling from the probes, that when people were in a state of focus, they spent significantly longer on email compared to the other states and the other communications types. When people were either bored or in a state of doing rote work, they spent significantly longer doing face-to-face interaction after. And when people were in a state of rote work, it was followed significantly by longer duration of Facebook use. And the way to interpret this data is that people first adopt particular attentional states, particular states of mind, which make them susceptible to particular kinds of interaction. Let's talk about email. So it took me 6 years to find a field site that was willing to let itself be cut off, to have its employees be cut off by email for a work week. And the reason we wanted to study this was to see, can we create an environment where people would have less interruptions? Could they focus longer, right? And so here's what we found. We had people in this workplace. We measured them in their baseline condition, and then we cut off their email for a work week. And we had them wear heart rate monitors, which provides a measure of heart rate variability. It's the variability of the distance between consecutive heartbeats. And we find that without email, people spend significantly longer duration of focus on any computer screen. And then the flip side, if you want to look at the data from the flip side, you can see that they switched about half as often. Now, heart rate variability revealed that people were significantly less stressed. You're looking at that number and you're saying, wait a minute, it's higher? How can that be? That's because the higher the variability of people's heart rate intervals, the intervals between the beats, the more relaxed people are. And that's because the least little bit of stimulus will cause you to jump, right? And it creates higher variability. If you're really stressed, you're in this fight or flight kind of syndrome. You know, the bear is chasing you, ready to run, and your heartbeats are more regular. So we find longer focus, and we find people are less stressed without email. Let's talk about workplace mood and social interactions. So there's two ways to measure workplace mood. So first of all, we wanted to see if people's face-to-face interaction would produce a different kind of mood in the workplace than online social interactions. And again, as I mentioned, Facebook was the most common platform used in this company. There's two ways of looking at this. At the time they occur, right, what makes people happier? And so let me ask you, how many of you think at the time they occur, face-to-face interactions make people happier than Facebook? How many of you think? Okay. How many of you think that Facebook, doing a Facebook interaction, makes people happier? Okay. The answer is face-to-face. We can also look at this at the end of the day, because this is really important, because the mood people have at the end of the day carries over into their personal lives. So this is really important to look at. How many of you think the more time spent on Facebook is associated with a happier mood at the end of the day? How many of you think the more time, wait, sorry, did I say face-to-face? Meant to say how many think face-to-face? The more time spent in face-to-face interaction at the workplace is associated with happier mood at the end of the day? Okay. And how many of you think the more time spent on Facebook is associated with a happier mood at the end of the day? We have one person. And one person, you are correct. It is Facebook. The more time people spend on Facebook. Now, why would that be the case, right? It's counterintuitive. Well, we dug into the data and we found that when people spent more time on Facebook, they were also more engaged in their work for that day. And now it makes sense, because if you're really working, you're really focused and engaged in your work, the last thing you want to have is a face-to-face interaction. Because when you have a face-to-face interaction, you're a prisoner of that interaction, right? You have the greeting ritual and the interaction and the parting ritual, and you can't just break away very quickly. But with Facebook, you can do what we call grazing behavior. You can move in and out pretty quickly, right? Under your control. And so that's why we think when people were engaged in their work, Facebook offers them a way to do grazing behavior, to take breaks under their control. So what about if we block distractions? What happens? Is it a good strategy to block distractions? Everybody complains about distractions from digital media. And there's not just a plethora of commercial apps that are developed to enable people to block distractions. Two basic approaches. One is you just simply cut off sites that people feel would be distracting. And the other approach is that you show people the amount of time they spend on different sites to increase their awareness, right? With the idea that if people become aware how much time they spend on social media, they might take action to change. So we did a field study, 32 information workers. We looked around for a commercial software to use. We found Freedom Software, which seemed like a pretty good choice. We measured people 5 days baseline the way they work normally, and then 5 days they were told to work as they normally would, but they used this freedom blocking software to block distractions. We let people choose what distractions they wanted to block. It comes with a default list of distractions, and then people could personalize it according to what they felt was most distracting for them. We used a scale that's called cognitive absorption, which has the following dimensions. These are all related to the idea of focusing. And we found that when distractions were cut off, people's focused immersion in their task increased significantly. Temporal dissociation decreased. Temporal dissociation is being unaware of time. People became more aware of time when distractions were blocked. There was no difference in people's sense of control, which totally surprised us. We thought there would be. And people's enjoyment decreased. Well, we took away people's social media. And there was no difference in curiosity, another dimension. Focus increased. We interviewed everyone. Two main reasons. We removed what's called attention residue. That's the idea of, let's say you go on Facebook, you become involved in the content, and that content stays with you. And when you switch back to your task, you're still thinking about Facebook. We took that residue away. We stopped chains of distraction. People report just rabbit holing. They go onto the internet, and then they just, before they know it, they're just kind of lost. But when we looked at the interviews, we found there are actually two very distinct groups of people. Those who reported being high in self-control of their work and those who reported being low. And indeed, when we did some more analyses, we found people who had high self-control were significantly more conscientious. It's a personality trait. And they were significantly less impulsive. Okay. Now, we went back and we looked at the data again in terms of these two different groups, and we found something really interesting. That the low self-control group, when their distractions were blocked, there really was no difference in their workload, the amount of mental expenditure that they had. Yes? TLX is the NASA TLX scale. It's the measure of workload. So it's a very common, very well-validated scale that's used for workload. However, we found something interesting with the high self-control group. People who are very conscientious people, that means they're very diligent in their work, people who feel that they're in control of their work, when distractions were cut off, guess what? Their workload increased significantly. So we found this interesting interaction. Why is that the case? Well, the reason is because people, these are diligent people, work hard, and they did not take breaks. Whereas the people who had low self-control, they took physical breaks. They went to the coffee room more. They interacted with people more. But people who were very high in self-control continued to work straight through without breaks. So of course their workload increased and their stress increased significantly. One person missed her shuttle at the end of the day. Never happened before because she was so immersed in work and didn't even take any breaks. So we see there's individual differences in the use of this kind of software to block distractions. People with low self-regulation, right, we see they're more likely to take physical breaks. We see less cognitive switching, so they did focus significantly longer. And so we hypothesize that the purpose of this kind of software is to offload this regulation ability to the software. People don't have that ability. It's not, innate for them, so they offload it onto the software. People who already have high self-regulation, well, when they use this kind of software to block distractions, they work longer, fewer physical breaks, and as a result, higher workload. And so our hypothesis is that using this kind of software actually interferes with people's ability to self-regulate, right? They do pretty well on their own. And so this whole idea of these, this huge business in distraction blocking software that one size fits all, it's not true. So there's a lot of opportunities to improve work experience based on this work. For example, we can think about balancing rote and focused work throughout the day, right? We don't want to overload people. We want to think about balancing people's moods. We can think about scheduling work based on attention patterns. And we can also think it's an opportunity for interventions that can nudge people to increase focus, reduce stress, and improve their mood. And this idea of nudging is something I've been thinking about quite a bit. And thinking about blocking distractions, but only for those with low control. Okay, now I'm gonna put on my psychologist hat to close here. Okay, so bear with me. Throughout the history of psychology, there has always been this idea that people take actions in order to achieve a kind of balanced emotional and psychological state. It's this common thread through eons of research. Hippocrates talked about this idea of harmonious balance with health. And Gestalt theorists, if you're familiar with them, talked about the law of pragmatics. Cannon talked about homeostasis. My favorite psychologist of all is Kurt Lewin, who talked about this idea of field theory, who said that everything we do in life, every action we take, is designed to reduce tension, because tension is uncomfortable. And you're probably familiar with cognitive dissonance theory, which also is this idea of how people can reduce this kind of imbalance between their attitudes and their behaviors. And so I would like to leave you with this idea that maybe people adjust their use of digital media in order to try to achieve an internal balance. So because information workers spend a good part, most of their day, working with digital media, maybe people use it in such a way that they're trying to create this internal balance. So the way they take breaks or don't take breaks, or the kinds of applications they choose to work on. Want to quickly talk about another project that I've just been working on. This is the largest sensing project yet that we have ever done, and to my knowledge that anyone has ever done in the workplace. And the idea here is to predict the workplace experience. So people's health and well-being using unobtrusive sensors, that's really key. We can't introduce any kind of sensors that would disrupt people's work experience. Our goal is to track 750 workers over 1 year. We have, to date, about 708 in the study, and we want it to be for a whole year because then we can track life events. We can look at what is the effect of significant life events like births and deaths and job changes and marriages and divorces. And we can look at seasons and how that affects and how all of this can be fed into the sensor data to help understand how it affects people's work lives. And we will use a robust sensing system comprised of wearable devices, beacons, phone agent, and we will use social media, but not look at content. We will just look at metadata. And you can learn more here. This work could not have been done without the collaboration of a number of really great colleagues who are listed here. And I'd like to thank funders and our participants. Thank you. So, if anyone has any questions.
We have the question box. Questions?
What's the difference between like being bored and stress?
Between what?
Boredom and stress. So low
Bored.
stress. How do you distinguish low stress from boredom?
Oh, okay. So there is actually, they are actually related, but you can have low stress and be happy. So there is this circumplex model of mood where if you can have low energy and negative affect. And that's different from having negative affect and high energy. That quadrant, negative affect, high energy, would be defined as stress, and the quadrant of negative affect and low energy would be related to boredom.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So most of your explanations are in terms of mood being affected by what work you do. To what extent do you think your data might be a case of what work you choose to do depending on your mood?
Oh, fascinating. We actually can't assign causality, right? And I did not mean to imply causality here. It's all correlation. Just like with these huge medical studies, like smoking and lung cancer, we can't imply causality. So we can't disentangle that, right? And it would be an interesting study, but that would have to be more of an experimental nature to be able to induce different kinds of moods and then to see what kind of work people choose. But it's hard when you're just tracking people in these kinds of observational studies to try to infer causality. But it's a good question.
This thing work. So this is information workers, so it's presumably an open office sort of setup?
Mixed.
Mixed.
It's mixed, yeah. Actually, most of them were not in open office settings.
Okay. Do you think that has any bearing on attention and things like that?
Yes, so it certainly has a bearing on interruptions. And so in other work, we found that in an open office setting, people were more likely to be interrupted for work that was peripheral to what they were doing, right? So your colleagues, help me debug this, or what's your opinion on this? And it's not work for which they're accountable. It's not tasks that they're assigned to do. This happens more in open office settings. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if you ask individuals, they might say, well, it's not a good thing. If you ask management, they might say, yeah, that's a good thing. We're sharing expertise. So
What about a sense of agency? Like you're saying, it seems like it's a competition of wills, right? Like who's going to win out? Is management going to win out, or is it individual? So do you think an open office deprives workers of a sense of agency? In other words, in determining when they'll be distracted, that kind of a thing?
yeah, that's really interesting. I'm not sure I would use the word agency. I would guess that people who have a strong sense of agency, high self-regulation, should be able to somehow create barriers, but this would be at a cost of perhaps being asocial and not being good colleagues. So there's this social trade-off as well, right? That it's not just agency, it's the idea you want to be a good organizational citizen, right? And you want to expend social capital so that you get social benefits in return someday. Someday when you have a problem, you want to be able to tap into someone else's expertise. So I think there's a lot of interesting things at play. Agency is perhaps one thing, but there's all kinds of social dynamics as well.
That's another.
Sure.
So I was back to that about causation, but with the longitudinal data that you're planning, you will know something about mood before people start work, and then can you then look at the work they choose to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So with this, we can look at time series when we have this kind of longitudinal data. I mean, we've looked at people over weeks, right? And to some extent, we can see this kind of causality based on time. But I would be a lot more confident to look at it over a much longer period of time. I mean, for example, we know that weather affects mood. It's causality because it's not the other way around, right? So we can look at factors like that, and how does the stock market, or factors that are really external to the workplace and how that's affecting people.
Thanks.
There's also this kind of cyclic behavior. For example, I have looked at sleep debt. Sleep debt is the accumulation of loss of sleep over time. And it's kind of a cyclic pattern, because if you don't get a lot of sleep, we find that people spend more time on lightweight activities like social media, Facebook, because it's easy, right? And then you sleep less. Oh, maybe it's because you didn't get your work done, and you need to work longer hours. So there can be these kinds of cyclical effects. Okay? Thank you.